Right. Is this working? This is new to me. I usually use the mic. Thanks very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is joint work with Guy Michaels from the LSE, and it's about the role that robots have played mainly in manufacturing sectors in developed economies in the past 25 years. So we were interested in this because we realized that that robots, are much improved now. If you think about, say, the flexibility of a human arm and human hands, this is pretty much what factory robots nowadays emulate. But of course they're even more flexible. They're even stronger, and they don't get tired, unlike humans. So think of modern robots as autonomous, flexible, very versatile machines. Basically, any tool that you can fit to that you can grab with your hands, you can now fit to a robotic arm. And importantly, you can also, and that used to be a problem before, you can use robots to link all the different steps of a manufacturing process. And that means you can actually have factories with not a single human working in them. In terms of the engineering problem that maybe used to be a bottleneck at some point, it was this moving flexibly in three dimensions that used to be a really hard problem. But with the increase in computing power, that seems to have been solved now. And if we look at robot density, by which we mean the number of robots employed per million hours worked by humans, this is increased by 150% over the past 25 years in the developed countries that we're looking at. And we also see that there's a growing interest in the impact of robots. So the Economist last year did a special report on them, a lot of coverage in the New York Times, including a very interesting video series. And also, of course, academics writing about this. Great book by Brynjolfsson and McAfee, The Second Machine Age, talking about many sort of different new technologies, what they might mean for the labor market. Similarly, a recent paper by David Autor. But we think of this work as sort of so far being quite speculative, and we think there is actually not a lot of hard evidence on the impact that robots have had on the economy. And of course, this is in contrast to a large body of literature looking at what ICT has done to the labor market, to productivity. So, in a way, if you're wondering, okay, so what's the difference here between robots and ICT? So robots is really about making physical stuff. ICT plays a role in there. You need software, of course, to control the robots. But it's really making about stuff. It's really still about manufacturing, which, of course, in terms of employment shares, is becoming less important. But that doesn't mean that these are not essential and important goods in the economy. We're also trying with this paper to link to a sort of wide-ranging debate in macro on what's called secular stagnation. So, which encompasses, I think, a wide range of phenomena: low productivity growth, low interest rates, slow recoveries from recessions, and probably these are all linked in some way, and it's not so clear, why we should see this low productivity growth. So if we're having all these amazing new technologies, why is it the case that productivity doesn't grow faster? And we hope to shed some light on this, by looking at the roles that robots have played. So the main question really that we're asking in this paper is what is the impact of industrial robots on growth? So GDP growth, but also productivity growth. And of course, we are also very interested in how robots have affected employment. Is it really the case that they crowd out workers? So in particular, what we do is the following. We construct this country industry panel data set of robot deliveries, and these we get from the International Federation of Robotics, the IFR, which sort of combines a lot of national robotics associations. And they've attempted, you know, in each year starting in 93 to really count the number of robots delivered to each two-digit industry in a range of countries. And we combine that with data on value-added, labor inputs and capital inputs from the EU CLEMS database. And there we have a breakdown as well of the labor input in high, middle, and low-skilled. And the capital input is broken down as well, but not to the extent that we would need it to be in order to study robots. So we really need to add the data from the IFR to be able to do this. And then what we do is very simple. We regress long differences. We take the difference between 2007 and 93 in the log of the outcome variables, say value added or employment, and regress that on some measure of a change in robot density. You know, using country dummies to control for country-specific trends, using industry dummies in some specifications. And to get closer to sort of a causal interpretation of our estimates, we develop an IV strategy where we instrument the increase in robot use using a measure of labor's replaceability at the industry level. So we look at the tasks that robots can do, and we look at occupations and how prevalent they were in industries before the use of robots. And that gives us sort of a way to look at variation in increased robot use that is really due to task mix of industries, and not because, you know, some industries might have faster productivity growth and therefore they adopt more robots, and then of course, you know, our estimates wouldn't have a causal interpretation. So that's the kind of thing that we try to address with the IV strategy. And what we find is a positive effect of robots on both value added and labor productivity. We calculate, sort of back of the envelope, that robots contributed about 0.36 percentage points to annual labor productivity growth between 93 and 2007. And that's about 1/6 of the total labor productivity growth in this period, which was around 2% on average. And we don't see a significant aggregate effect on hours worked, but there is some evidence that robots hurt the employment of low and middle skilled workers. And we do many specification checks, falsification exercises to make sure the IV isn't invalid, and the results are robust to all these checks. I think I skipped the literature review in the interest of time. I want to present a very simple model of robots and workers, and the purpose of this model is really to sort of fix ideas about what would we expect in terms of effects on employment. I think the effects on productivity are maybe obvious, but on employment not so much. So very simple, two sectors. So the consumer has preferences over the outputs of two sectors, and one of the sectors uses robots, and the output is noted by YR, and the other, YN, doesn't use robots. And epsilon is just the elasticity of substitution consumption. So the robot-using sector actually combines robots and labor in this CS fashion, and the non-robot-using sector is just a linear production function in labor. And sigma is the elasticity of substitution between robots and labor. Suppose this is, a neoclassical economy, perfect competition. It's static as well, and we assume that there is this exogenous rental price of robots, rho, and that's our main comparative statics exercise. Like, what happens if this price falls? We suppose that labor is in fixed supply, but it's perfectly mobile across sectors. So what do we find? Well, if rho falls, then maybe not surprisingly, so robot density increases in the robot-using sector. You're sort of substituting away from labor, increasing robot use relative to labor. Also, labor productivity increases in that sector. And the robot-using sector has more output at a lower price. Okay, so what happens to employment in terms of the allocation of employment between these two sectors? Actually, that's ambiguous. So employment increases in the robot using sector if and only if the substitution elasticity in consumption is larger than that in production. And it might decrease if the opposite is true. And what's the intuition for that? Well, it's actually not that complicated. So the price of robots falls. Then what happens is the firms substitute cheaper robots for workers. And producing at a lower cost, it means the supply curve of the robots using sector shifts out. And moving along the demand curve, the quantity sold of the robot using sector increases in equilibrium. Now, depending on how strong this response of the consumers is to the relatively lower price, it might be that the robot using sector needs to hire more workers to actually satisfy this increased demand. If epsilon is high, if consumers respond a lot to this lower price, then actually employment in the robots using sector might even increase. This gives us sort of a way to interpret our results and maybe argue that it's not so surprising that we don't find an aggregate effect on employment. We have an extension of the model which is sort of meant to motivate the IV, where I want to just talk about this very briefly, where we allow for a continuum of sectors now and a choice of technology. So each sector chooses whether to use the technology that employs robots or the labor-only technology. And what varies between these sectors is the share of tasks that can be done by robots. And then, not surprisingly perhaps, the higher is this share, the more likely a sector is to adopt robots. And when prices of robots fall, the response of these sectors, in terms of increasing robot use, is larger. The larger is this share of replaceable tasks. And we try in our IV strategy actually to measure this and then to predict increased robot use using this share as an IV. So what are robots actually, or what are industrial robots? So there's a technical definition which emphasizes that they have to be automatically controlled. They have to be reprogrammable and multi-purpose, so they can do many different things, and you can change over time what you want to use them for. And they're programmable in 3 or more axes. So this is this issue of flexibility. And that's what they usually look like. So it's really just like an arm. And then you can fit various tools to this arm. And this is how they might be arranged. This is an assembly line where cars are made. Okay. So there are many different applications. This is packaging, picking and placing what are pancakes, I think, painting, welding. So sort of classic industrial applications. Nowadays, there are more and more service robots, but we actually don't have data on them going back as far as we have on the industrial robots. So looking at the service robots is sort of left for future work. Of course, they're much cooler and much more interesting. But you have to wait for that paper. This is actually, so of the service robots you see here, this is the only one that actually exists. And, it can pour drinks and climb stairs, and all these things were incredibly difficult to engineer. But it's getting better now. How do we construct our data? So we are interested in the stock of robots in use at a given point in time, in a given industry, in a given country. So we use our deliveries of robots. So we have the counts delivered in each year. And then apply the perpetual inventory method using a 10% depreciation rate to construct the stock of robots. And as I said before, robot density is just the stock of robots divided by a million hours worked. What are the limitations of our data? Well, as is the case with many macro data on labor inputs, capital inputs, these are, of course, heterogeneous inputs. Their quality is changing over time. And we try to address some of these limitations by also looking at prices but our price data is very aggregate as well. So certainly the data we're using are not perfect. Nevertheless, when we do sort of use these indices in robustness checks, and when we vary the depreciation rate, which also goes some way in addressing some issues with quality updating and so on, we find very similar results. So we match our robots data with data from EU CLEMS. As I said, you know, it's value-added hours, capital services, wage bill, TFP growth, and so on. Importantly, this is how we construct the replaceability IV. So we have a list of robot applications from the IFR data, so things like welding, processing, assembling. And we match that to three-digit occupations from the 2000 US census, in the sense that we say, okay, an occupation in the census has a replaceability value of 1 if its title contains one of these robot applications. Okay? And then we map that to the 1980 US occupations and compute for each industry in our sample the fraction of replaceable hours based on the use of these occupations. So this was before there were any robots. This is just what we think is behind the rise in robot use, is this fall in prices. So in quality adjusted terms, prices have gone down by 80%. Okay, which looks impressive, but of course, if you compare that to, say, the change in computing power, in the price of computing power, that's sort of many orders of magnitude larger. But anyway, you know, this is quite a big decline. And here's our data aggregated to the industry level. So we plot productivity growth against the decile rank, basically, of change in robot density, and you see a positive relationship. You see industries that have increased robot use a lot include transport equipment, industries that still are using very few robots, construction, education, R&D. And by the way, these are the industries that we're using in our paper. So this is, in terms of value added, and employment is about 1/3 on average of an economy. And it's mainly manufacturing, but also things like utilities, agriculture, education. And this is our first stage. So again, the rank in increase of robot use against the fraction of hours replaceable. And you see that in industry like transport equipment, which has a huge share of replaceable hours, is also at the top in terms of the increase in robot use. And the reduced form, plotting productivity growth against our IV, the fraction of hours replaceable. So let me quickly go to the main results. So we actually use, in terms of the functional form, we use the percentile of the increase of robot use, and that's because we have so many zeros at the beginning of our data. So many observations where just no one is using robots. So it's not possible to take the log. And we find, if you look at the second column in each set of results, this controls for country trends, positive effects on value added, both in the OLS and the IV, on productivity growth, as well as on value added. A very small coefficient here when hours growth is the outcome, so employment growth, except that in this baseline specification, actually the IV is negative insignificant. But this is something that doesn't survive a single robustness check. So that's why we don't stress this result as much. In all our robustness checks, this coefficient becomes small in magnitude and insignificant. So we have, we think it's important, you know, to make sure that the IV isn't picking up anything that is unrelated to robot use. We look at the relationship between the outcomes and the IV, so sort of true and fake reduced forms. So panel A is just our true reduced form. So there is a positive relationship, as we'd expect. And then panel B is looking at observations where there weren't any robots in use in '93. Okay? And of course, many of these have started using robots. So over the period 93 to 2007, again, we see a positive relationship. That's not surprising. But if we look at the same observations before 93, so the 14-year period before that, when we think, well, if they didn't have robots in 93, then they didn't have robots in 79. So if our instrument only works through increased robot use, then we shouldn't see a relationship here. And we don't see that. The sort of more heroic exercise is to look at observations that didn't even have robots in 2007, and there are very few of them, and see if there's a relationship between the IV and the outcomes. And again, there isn't. So we think that this is reassuring evidence that our IV is valid. Skip the robustness checks, but I'm happy to talk about it after the presentation or in questions. In terms of further outcomes, we find a negative effect on output prices, as we've motivated in our model. That's what we should expect. Positive effect on TFP. This is, of course, because robots aren't measured properly in data sets like EU CLEMS. So their TFP residual basically should include the robots, and we confirm that here. Positive effect on wages. Imprecisely estimated effect on the labor share. So the coefficients are negative, and economically they would be, quite meaningful, but they're imprecisely estimated. And we find a negative effect on the hours and the wage bill of lower skilled workers, and to a lesser extent middle skilled workers. So in that sense, robots look like very traditional skill-biased technological change. There doesn't seem to be a lot of polarization coming from the robots. And maybe almost the concluding slide is, so what about magnitude? So how important has the contribution of robots been? So we ask a very simple question, as I said, this is sort of back of the envelope calculation. So how large would value added and labor productivity have been if robot densities had stayed at their 1993 levels? And then we calculate that, well, they'd both been about 5% lower, and then annualizing this gives us a contribution of 0.37 and 0.36 percentage points of annual growth, which was 3.1% in the case of value added and 2% in the case of labor productivity. And this is economy-wide. So it's quite a large contribution. It's similar to that of ICT and other major technological advances. A bit smaller, but also robots are a smaller share of capital. So in that sense, I think it's fair to say that they're similar. Okay, so that's the conclusion. For the first time, we've analyzed these data on robots, and what's the contribution of robots to economies, the effect on productivity and labor markets, positive impact of robots on value added and productivity, nothing on aggregate employment. In terms of the future, in terms of secular stagnation and so on. A negative aspect might be, okay, but there are probably diminishing returns to robot use. Actually, we see that in some of our estimates. But so far robots have been confined to sort of only this 1/3 of sectors of the economy, and in the future that's certain to change. And there are signs that service robots are improving and becoming more widely used. And in that sense, I think we can be optimistic that robots will contribute to productivity growth in the future as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Georg.